So welcome everyone to this evening's webinar for the Freshwater Stewardship community. We're really excited to have Jake here from the Rideau Roundtable talking to us about a really prevalent and unfortunate issue that places across Canada and the world are facing, and just a kind of a nice case study that he's going to present the work that Rideau Roundtable is doing with different volunteers and how they're trying to tackle this issue. Before we get kind of into that, we're just going to do a quick overview and some housekeeping. And then at the end, we encourage you to stick around for that Q&A. We'll also be talking about some education resources and our next webinar happening at the end of the month about invasive species. So like I said, there are going to be a couple of people here with you today for the presentation. My name is Monica. I'm the Communications and Fundraising Coordinator at Watersheds Canada. Also have Samantha with us here, who is going to be helping with some of the back end. So if you have any problems with technology or you have any questions about the work that Watersheds does, Samantha and I are both available for you. We also, of course, have Jake here from the Rideau Roundtable. So he is the Voyager Canoe Program Coordinator. And if you have any questions for him, his email is on the screen. We also will be sending a follow-up email to everyone after this session. So we will include the recording as well as any resources that are mentioned and some shareable links. So if you think, you know, your lake group or your community, your family would be interested in what's talked about tonight, you'll have all those easy resources in one spot and you can share it with them. So a bit about this community that we have online. So we have over 900 members who have joined us throughout the year. We started in January with the Freshwater Stewardship community, really focusing on getting connected with Canadians where we weren't able to meet in person anymore. We wanted to try and replicate as much as possible in an online space. So it actually has gone far beyond Canada alone. We have members from across 7 countries. And we are usually having at least one webinar a month, if not 2, and creating different resources from those webinars. So it can be a summary of what was talked about, it can be further resources. A couple of the sessions were about identification of different local species, so some external resources, community science projects that you can participate in, that sort of thing. So if you've missed any of those webinars, I would really encourage you to go to probably the website you went to register for tonight, which is watersheds.ca/freshwater-stewardship. And you'll be able to watch all of those old recordings and access all of those free education resources. And we would like to thank the SM Blair Family Foundation for funding the Freshwater Stewardship community this year. So who we are, just really quickly, who Watersheds Canada is. We're a charitable nonprofit based in Perth, Ontario, which is about an hour away from Ottawa. We focus really on working with individuals, community groups, and youth to take local action to protect their freshwater quality. So we do that through a couple of different programs, such as the Natural Edge, which is our shoreline renaturalization program. We're putting in different native plant species to protect shorelines. We also have the Love Your Lake program that we deliver in coordination with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and that is a shoreline assessment and stewardship program. We also do habitat restoration work, education programs for children in classrooms and with community groups like Girl Guides and Boy Scouts, and then of course online spaces like this one. So I am just going to introduce Jake, our speaker tonight. So as I mentioned, he is the Voyager Canoe Program Coordinator at the Rideau Roundtable. He is a recent graduate of the Outdoor Adventure Naturalist Program with Algonquin College. And after coordinating a shoreline cleanup project for the Rideau Environmental Action League and the Rideau Roundtable last fall, Jake became very connected to the problem of the large amount of plastics that were found in the river. So since then, he has conducted research on the issue and learned about some effective ways that we can all reduce plastics that end up in our rivers. Jake is passionate about sustainability and wants to help others learn about the environmental challenges that are occurring today and how to have a sustainable lifestyle. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and switch over to Jake's presentation. And I will also, pass it over to you, Jake.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, so welcome everyone to plastics in our waterways, or rather the problem of plastics in our waterways and what we can do to help. So the Rideau Roundtable is the organization I work for, again, as the Voyager Canoe Program Coordinator right now. And last fall, winter, and spring, I was an intern with the Rideau Roundtable as a riparian restoration specialist. And during this position, I coordinated this shoreline cleanup that I'll be speaking about, as well as a shoreline naturalization project. So the Rideau Roundtable is an incorporated not-for-profit association of individuals, community groups, business groups, and other partners. And it is based out of Smiths Falls, Ontario, again, just about an hour away from Ottawa, close to Perth. And the mission of the Rideau Roundtable is to promote and encourage the wise and sustainable management of the Rideau Waterway. So tonight, this is what the flow of the presentation will look like. First, I'll take a few minutes to look at all that our waterways, or some of what our waterways provide for us, why it is very important for us to preserve and protect the quality of our waterways from plastic pollution, specifically from our perspective. Then we'll get into one of the biggest challenges our waterways and all over the world, as well as oceans, are facing, which is plastic pollution. So I'll talk about it. Yeah, so I'll talk about what we did with our shoreline cleanup last fall, how I really got connected with the problem of plastics in our waterways through this. And as I researched the issue more and more, I got to see just how big it was. And I became very passionate about sharing this with others, sharing the impacts of our plastic garbage is having on our freshwater and ocean ecosystems. Then I'll talk about some simple and effective ways that we can reduce plastic waste and keep them out of our waterways. And I'll specifically focus a lot on the problem of microplastics and plastic microfibers coming from our synthetic clothing, because when I did in my research, I found that this was actually one of the biggest impacts that plastic is having on our waterways and oceans is coming from these microplastics. And then, yeah, I'll do my best to answer some of your questions at the end, and based on some of the research that I did in this internship position. So we can go ahead and get started. So let's start with some of the gifts that our waterways provide for us. They are innumerable, and our life and health is completely inseparable from the health of the river. So here are some of those gifts, which are heavily dependent on keeping the water quality very good without plastic pollution. So we can go to the next slide. While this may seem obvious, they provide us with clean water to drink. In fact, as well known, water is life. We can't last 3 days without it, not to mention the clean water that we need for cooking, whether that's steaming, boiling, mixing, washing, etc. Imagine living in an area of the world where water is heavily polluted to the point where we can't get water that we can drink or cook with from these rivers, and how much more would we have to conserve the clean water we have, in some cases travel to go gather it. It is easy to forget how much water, how much clean water we have in Canada here because of its abundance and rivers and lakes, and its relatively clean state of water. But this clean water could be in jeopardy if we do not take good care of our freshwater waterways and prevent them from being polluted with too much plastic. Rivers here provide us with clean water to clean everything in our house, including our bodies. And we're very fortunate to have this clean and sanitary water to do this without an excess of chemicals to keep us clean and keep us as disease-free as we are able to be here in Canada. And then, of course, we have the water for irrigation, the water our animals use to drink and our plants soak up, as well as in the washing and processing of our food, and as well in not only in the growing. And how important is it that we keep microplastics out of this water that is being used for our food? when our livestock drink water with microplastics, these plastics will enter into their bodies and into their organs. When our food is grown and processed with contaminated water with plastics, these are getting into these plants and therefore into our bodies. And research is showing that we are consuming way more microplastics than we might think, though the true amount is still very much unknown. And this causes all kinds of unknown health effects as well. You can go to the next slide. So looking at our total water consumption, according to the Environmental Protection Agency, the average Canadian or American will use about 110,000 liters of water per year in their day-to-day, in their household use. And how much is this? Well, this swimming pool that's on our farm in front of you on the screen now, this swimming pool is about 24 feet wide and 4 to 4.5 feet deep, holding roughly 55,000 liters of water. So that means that the average Canadian will go through 2 of these swimming pools every year to make up this 110,000 liters of water. If this is how much water we are using from our waterways every year, how important is it that we preserve and protect this water quality? How important is it that we show our reciprocity and give back by ensuring that our rivers and lakes remain healthy and remain in a, and are able to sustain the life and the ecosystems that live in it? Go ahead to the next one. Rivers are also providing habitat for aquatic animals like ducks, fish, beavers, river otters, and many others, many of which provide food for us to eat through hunting and sometimes at the grocery store. They also provide critical nourishment for terrestrial animals. In fact, 70% of all terrestrial species rely on the shoreline of our waterways at some point of their life cycle, which is why the shoreline is referred to as the ribbon of life. And now, researchers are finding areas of rivers with fish who have mercury levels which are far too high for us to safely consume, and along with other pollutants and other chemicals getting into the fish, specifically through microplastics, which I'll talk about soon. So these animals' lives and the health and well-being of us who rely on these animals for our food are in jeopardy if we're not able to be careful about reducing our plastic consumption. So the next gift, go ahead, next slide. Oh, sorry, next one. So also think of all the tourism that the Rideau River brings to the area. How much money Parks Canada gets from sending people through those locks, and all the stores and cottages, how much money they make, and supporting the local economy in the area, or people just wanting to come live near the rivers, build homes. The list goes on and on and on. So the rivers are providing us with space to engage in so many fun activities like boating, like swimming, like canoeing. Who is going to want to take a vacation, swim, or travel through polluted rivers with so much plastic pollution? For our own economic benefit, it is critical that we take proper care of our waterways. Next slide. And let us not forget the amazing feeling that we get just by being by the water, whether we visit it often at a cottage or spend time on the waterways or live on it. They provide a very profound calming effect and beauty, and many of us rely on that space by the river to find that relaxation and release. So we can see in all these different ways how our livelihood relies on the freshwater waterways, but there are some major challenges, including plastic pollution, which is putting all of these benefits in jeopardy. Next slide. So now I'll get into some of the challenges our waterways are facing because of the plastics in our waterways. And again, I grew very connected to this issue. I knew it was a problem, but I didn't really know how big of a problem it was until I conducted or coordinated the Shoreline Cleanup with the Rideau Roundtable in October 2020 and did all the research following it. Next slide. So the first project of my internship was to coordinate this shoreline cleanup project in October. And in this article, you see one of the days, which involved members of the community coming out to help with this cleanup in our Voyager canoe. So this was on day 3. And on the other 3 days, I went out on my own to try to accumulate as much garbage as possible. And I got through this, I really started to get a good sense of how much plastic was in our waterways. So this is an article published by Evelyn Harford of Inside Ottawa Valley on their news site, and you can go read that if you wish. Next slide. So this is day 1. This is the route I canoed on this one, highlighted in yellow. This is on the west side of Smiths Falls in the wetland called the Swale. And you can see in this image, there are a couple like hot spots of where there was a lot of plastic garbage outlined in red. Down at the bottom left of this image, you see it by the Bascule Bridge around the park on Duck Island. And then on the right side up by Highway 43, there was also a significant amount where I got most of my plastic that day. Go to the next slide. And the route covered in day 2 went again by canoe just around the shorelines. And these are the red is the hot spots, one by a park area on the far left of the route. But then the other 2 were again by Highway 43, and I believe that's Highway 12 on the south side of the Rideau River. So by the roadway, I was starting to see a trend emerge here. You can go to the next slide. So then, leaving by Lower Reach Park on day 3, this was again the day where the community got involved in our Voyager canoe. And again, you can see on the left side, there was a bit of a wetland area here where it was kind of an area for a lot of garbage to get trapped in. So that's, I think, why there was a lot in there. But then again, the hot spot on the right side by the roadway. So you can go to the next slide. So by now it was clear that by far the most plastic was being collected by the roadsides, and I could focus my attention only there for day 4. I didn't even have to go out in the canoe, and I could collect a lot more garbage. So this is day 4, in between Edmonds and Old Sly's Lock Station. And on this day, I decided, to stick to the roadsides, and ended up getting half of all the garbage collected in 1 out of 4 days. Next slide. So here you can see all the different piles of garbage collected on each of the days. Vanessa Bernicki of the town of Smiths Falls was very helpful, collected all of this garbage from us and sorted it and weighed it for us and was disposed of it for us. The garbage totaled was about 390 pounds. Next slide. And this was mostly plastic. So here we have a chart of all the different weights of the different kinds of materials. Now, of course, weight isn't very good portrayal of volume. So the recyclable cans, of course, cans weigh way less than glass. But here we see the majority of everything that was collected was in fact plastic on the left there. And you can see that on day 4, focusing by the roadsides, 49% of all the garbage collected by weight was on that 4th day. Next slide. So I had always heard about it, but it wasn't until I got out there, really started picking it up, researching about it, that I got a real sense of the magnitude of the plastic problem. It turns out Canada is especially bad for plastic waste. It produces more solid waste per capita than any other country in the world, even US and China. Solid waste is considered garbage, sludge, and other materials like from treatment plants, agriculture, industry, that kind of stuff. But this garbage and waste that Canada is producing is thrown out, recycled, and in many cases thrown out the windows of vehicles like I saw on this shoreline cleanup, or dumped illegally, and is very often, very unfortunately, ending up in our waterways. Next. As I found here in this picture by the Rideau River in between Old Slides Lock Station and Edmonds Lock Station, where a lot of garbage was on the shoreline from people throwing it out their windows. If this is not picked up, when high waters come in the spring, much of this garbage is going to flow further downstream, a lot of it ending up in the oceans. In fact, on the Ottawa River, for a piece of plastic to travel in the river, it will take about 7 days for it to travel from Ottawa to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. If it stays, it would slowly break down into microplastics. Then it would make a much easier way as a suspended load through the river down to the ocean, or it stays into the ecosystems and creates many challenges for the wildlife here. And I had a hard time finding research on the effects of plastics and microplastics in our freshwater ecosystems, but there are some new studies revealing some shocking results. For example, the Canadian Wildlife Foundation reports that researchers have found polymer fibers, which are little plastic microfibers, and plastic pellets in the digestive tracts of fish in Lake Erie. When these fish absorb these microplastics or ingest these plastic particles, contaminants leach from these particles and cause liver damage. In addition to this, another shocking study has revealed that, according to National Geographic, in 1960, fewer than 5% of seabirds, including gulls, cormorants, terns, and all kinds of other seabirds, were found to have plastic in their stomach. In 1980, an estimated 80% of seabirds had plastic in their stomach. And now that number has risen to a staggering 90% of seabirds have plastic in their stomach. And a recent study has found that 67% of seabirds have decreased in population from 1950 to 2010. So this is becoming a very, very big issue. Next. Here you'll see an image of an albatross on a remote Pacific island, showing us just how bad this seabird problem is. There are countless images like this on the internet. You can find this one is specifically from Chris Jordan. He has done some amazing work documenting the deaths of albatross on a remote Pacific island, and you can check out more of his work on chrisjordan.com. But for now, let's look at what happens when these plastic pieces flow into the oceans. Next. So here's a little bit of an overview. There's an estimated 5.25 trillion pieces of plastic floating or resting at the bottom of the ocean. The Canadian government estimates that over 8 million tons of plastic flows into our oceans worldwide. That is the equivalent of one garbage truck of plastic being dumped into the ocean every single minute. This has significant impacts on marine wildlife. For just to give a couple examples, there are so many examples, but just for this one, sea turtles mistake plastic bags as jellyfish and consume the bags as food. And these bags can then cause intestinal blockages, preventing turtles from being able to feed, basically leading to starvation. In fact, 22% of sea turtles who ingest just one piece of plastic will die, according to the World Wildlife Foundation. Plastic pollution in the ocean causes more major health problems and even death for whales, who are filter feeding near the surface of the water, seeking plankton, but instead getting a big mouthful of plastic. And there are countless other examples of the impacts of plastic on marine wildlife, many of which are undiscovered at this point. This problem is only growing larger. Our plastic production has more than tripled since the 1990s. A Plastic Ocean is a great documentary to show the impacts of plastics in the ocean, and I highly suggest you watch it. I believe it would still be on Netflix at this point. So we have talked a lot about the problem. Now, what can we do about it? Can we recycle? Well, before I get into some ways that I feel would be great for us to help, I want to talk about why recycling might not actually be the best way for us to reduce our plastic pollution. Next. We thought recycling would really help us with this issue, but the numbers are pretty problematic for recycling in Canada. I'll just quickly go over this. According to the Canadian government and the CBC, 80 kilograms of plastic waste is produced per person per year in Canada. Only 9% of this gets recycled. Of this 9%, much of what we are told gets recycled actually ends up getting incinerated or placed in a landfill. And 17% of this recycling gets exported legally or sometimes illegally, usually to third world countries for recycling, and much of it is still sitting there, has not been, and will probably never get used there. And it is actually often, according to CBC, it is often processed dangerously by underpaid workers, or it gets illegally burned and emits toxic fumes, and that's creating some problems for some health challenges for those developing countries. And this is all to say that recycling is not really the best way to justify buying more plastic. And therefore, the real solution is to figure out how we can reduce plastics as much as we can, especially single-use plastics. Next. So how we can help with our plastics. Food and drink packaging. We can try to cut down on this as much as possible. So we can go shopping at Bulk Barn using their reusable container program. We can place food directly, or the produce directly, into our cart, or use cloth bags for the produce. We can avoid using overpackaged foods such as soft drink juice boxes and heavily packaged snacks like granola bars. Consider making your own and using containers. And also, a big one that's really easy to forget about is to not buy plastic water bottles. Of course, it's pretty simple to bring around your own reusable water bottle all over wherever you go. And these plastic water bottles that we buy from the store, they are just so easy to misplace. Even though we think we have a good handle on them, we think we know where they are at all times, it's really easy to set them down in the wrong spot or to drop them. And that is how much of these plastic water bottles are ending up in our waterways, which was so much of what we picked up on these shoreline cleanup projects were plastic water bottles. And then probably 2/3 of everything we picked up was associated with fast food packaging. Basically, food or drinks that you can pick up on the fly and go with. And this was beer, soft drinks, energy drinks, and of course, the fast food from the meals from fast food restaurants. Next. Another way that was mentioned to me is to limit online shopping instead shop at your local store. So over packaging is a big problem for online shopping. I remember receiving this speaker right here in a box that was about 10 times the size that it needed to be, all filled with those little pieces of plastic in the top right image there, which was a box probably about that size to carry this little speaker. And that tends to be the theme with everything that I receive in the mail when it comes to online shopping. So shopping locally is a big way to help reduce plastic consumption. Now, I wanted to avoid overwhelming with so much info because there are so many ways, but I wanted to stick with what I felt was some of the most easy and effective ways to help reduce this plastic consumption in our daily lives. But what about preventing the plastics and the garbage we do use from getting in our waterways? Next slide. So the first way is to get out there and actually pick up the garbage on the shorelines. There are many community garbage cleanup initiatives happening. You can organize one yourself or just go pick it up. It's really simple, and you'll be amazed at how many garbage bags you can fill in a short amount of time, especially in some of the heavily polluted areas. And another way is to make sure that we dispose of our waste properly. This is very important, that we do not dump garbage anywhere that it's not supposed to be. Always put it where it's meant to go. Don't overflow public garbage bins, because it seems like these pieces of plastic, these pieces of garbage are very secure. But when the wind blows or there's a heavy rainfall, everything in a community is designed to flow downhill, downgrade, over the sidewalk, into the storm sewer, into our rivers, into the ditches from wherever we're dumping. And plants will catch a lot of these if we unfortunately dump them when they're not supposed to go. But they will break down and have a much easier way of traveling when in that broken down state. Next. So as part of my research, I'll kind of transition into the next phase here and talk about microplastics, because as part of my research for the Shoreline Cleanup project, I discovered that microplastics, more specifically plastic microfibers from our synthetic clothing, is a huge problem. So I wanted to focus on this because this is an area that we have a lot of control over. This was made obvious, this problem, by an old synthetic carpet I picked up during this shoreline cleanup, which almost entirely disintegrated in my hands as I was trying to pick up this big plastic carpet. All these little tiny plastic microfibers covered the ground and fell into the river. I tried to get everything that I possibly could, but it was impossible to clean it up all, as I just watched thousands, millions of little tiny pieces of plastic go into the river and or be beside the river, which come high water, come the next rainfall, that's where it's going to go. And of course, many of these microplastics flow through our rivers into the oceans. And I'm going to focus on oceans right now because that's where most of the research I could find was. Microplastic effects on freshwater ecosystems wasn't very easy for me to come by as I was trying to develop some of the research behind this, but it will be, you can imagine if it's having this kind of impact on the oceans, what kind of impact it would be having on our freshwater waterways. So this picture on the screen is of microplastics in the ocean. You can see the difference between the microplastics and the plastic microfibers. The microfibers are the little thread-like pieces, and these come from, yes, our clothes, also our blankets, our sheets, our whatever is made out of fabric, synthetic fabric specifically. So you know that big plastic patch twice the size of Texas in the Pacific Ocean that we've all heard of? Well, it's actually more of a microplastic soup, partly from the plastics that have gone into the ocean breaking down by a UV exposure, but also significantly from microplastics flowing into the ocean via the rivers and flowing there from ocean currents. So these statistics are coming from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature on the screen here. Microplastics in the ocean, this huge patch, along with all the other microplastics in the ocean, come from an estimated 35% of these plastic microfibers, mainly coming from our clothing, 28% from our tires, which I was very surprised to hear about, because it turns out the rubber of our tires aren't actually natural rubber, it's actually synthetic rubber, which is basically plastic. And that whenever we drive, little pieces of microplastics will wear off from our tires and flow into the rivers, into the oceans. And the best defense we have against this at this point is to keep our tires properly inflated until better innovation can happen there. And then there's city dust at 24%, road markings, and then a bunch of miscellaneous stuff at the bottom, which is all great to focus on, but I'm going to be specifically focusing on clothing, considering the very large percentage that is coming from it. So what are the impacts of these microplastics in our oceans? Oh, previous slide. We'll stay on that one for a second. So the microplastics actually inhibit phytoplankton's ability to photosynthesize, which is the process which creates oxygen and sequesters carbon. Phytoplankton are the main primary producers of the ocean. They play a key role in the production of oxygen on our planet. The primary producers in the ocean account for an incredible 80% of the world's oxygen production, as well as 45% of the world's carbon fixation. However, when these primary producers, specifically phytoplankton, are exposed to microplastics, their rate of photosynthesis reduces by 45%, largely due to light not being able to reach them. In the Western Mediterranean Sea, there's a ratio of 1 to 2 for plastic to phytoplankton, and much of this plastic would be in the form of microplastics. And of course, there's a lot of phytoplankton in freshwater as well. So this was a very shocking statistic that was very, very alarming. Next. And this one was also a shocking study. To give you an idea of the scale of the amount of microplastics flowing into our rivers, Environment International conducted a study which collected the microplastics, which fell from the air onto the top of a 9-story building in London. They took 8 1-square-meter samples, and in these 8 samples, they found that between 575 and 1,008 pieces of microplastics fell per day falling from the air. Most of these microplastics which fell from the air were microfibers, while 8% of them came from materials most often used in food packaging. And of course, every raindrop which falls on the rooftop, the sidewalk, or the roadway in a city, if it doesn't evaporate, if it rains hard enough, all of these flow downgrade into the storm drains and flows into the rivers. And imagine how many pieces of microplastics which have fallen onto 1 square meter in London. Imagine how many billions of pieces of microplastics are now flowing into the rivers from these big cities, from any community or city, every single rainfall. In terms of the effects on our local waterways, like I mentioned before, I'd love to have more information for you on this, but this will be the next phase of research for me if I continue to dive deeper into this, and that is the Canadian Wildlife Foundation reports that, the one example that I have at this point, the Canadian Wildlife Foundation reports that researchers have found that those polymer fibers and plastic pellets in the digestive tracts of fish in Lake Erie, and when they absorb these or ingest the plastic particles, contaminants leach from these particles and cause liver damage. So you can only imagine, if this is just one study that has been done on fish, all of the impacts that are happening on our freshwater ecosystem. So in order to address this microplastics and plastic microfiber issue, we must look at our clothing, which is producing 35% of the microplastics polluting the environment. So this is where my focus will go, as it is one of the most effective ways to reduce this. Next. So here's a breakdown of the clothing materials that I found in my home. Most sources say that 60% of our clothing is made of synthetic materials. My personal clothing stock by weight was around 55% in pure synthetic, as well as mixed synthetic, and also natural fibers like cotton and wool on the right. Next. These synthetic fibers include polyester, fleece, nylon, spandex, acrylic, and the list goes on. These are all made from oil, which comes from the refining process, and many harmful chemicals are released during the synthetic microfiber production. This also poses a pretty big risk to our waterways, in other ways too. And these materials become especially a big issue when we start washing our clothes. Next. For an average wash load of 6 kilograms, over 100,000 plastic microfibers can be released per wash. These then flow into our waterways and eventually into the oceans. And according to the United Nations Environmental Program, laundry accounts for 500,000 tons of microfibers flowing into the oceans every year. This is because water treatment plants release up to 40% of these microfibers into the rivers, lakes, and oceans. They can only catch a little bit more than half, and that is depending on what level of treatment that water treatment plant conducts. It can be less than that if it's a lower, if it provides a lower level of treatment. These microfibers are then often eaten by aquatic creatures and entering the food web. So what is the solution to all of this? Well, again, I want to talk about what we can do, but first I want to talk about what we think might be the solution. But it turns out that the water consumption of cotton, especially in considering the areas where it is grown, actually makes it not the best sustainable choice. Next. So water overconsumption is a big problem in water scarce parts of the world. In water scarce parts of the world, it's very important that we reduce water consumption compared to how important it is in Canada, although Canada certainly does not have an endless supply of water, but some areas are facing some major challenges with water overconsumption because of cotton alone. For example, on the screen here, we see the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. This has been mostly lost due to water diversion, and it is suspected that the main reason for this water diversion is the production of cotton. So you can see in this image the coastline that did exist in 1960, and every decade or so you can see how it has gradually decreased to the point where it is almost completely gone in 2009. I'm curious to know what the state of this lake is, but we can see the damaging effects of cotton there. And next slide. And then one other example is from this is from the World Wildlife Foundation. I got this. An estimated 97% of the Indus River flowing through India, China, and Pakistan has been diverted mainly for cotton production. So this picture is also from the World Wildlife Foundation. So just how much cotton water does cotton use? Next. Well, according to UNESCO, with the green, blue, and gray water all combined, one simple, I'm going to assume medium cotton t-shirt, consumes about 2,700 liters of water in its production. And one pair of jeans consumes or takes about 10,500 liters of water to create. Those are pretty incredible numbers. And in addition to this, just one more point I'll touch on cotton. According to the World Wildlife Foundation, conventional production practices for cotton involve the application of a substantial amount of pesticides and fertilizers. And then they go on to say that these threaten the quality of the soil and the water, as well as the health of the biodiversity in and downstream from all of these fields. Runoff from these pesticides and fertilizers and minerals from cotton fields will contaminate rivers, lakes, and wetlands and underground water aquifers. Next. So now let's look into what are actually the good clothing materials that we can go to, the good sustainable alternatives for synthetic clothing materials, or again, synthetic fabrics in general. Next. So organic cotton solves the pesticide usage for cotton, but not the high water usage. It is definitely the cheapest of the quote unquote sustainable alternatives. Considering this is a natural material not giving off harmful microplastics, and the pesticide use reduction, it is certainly better than nothing. The term organic cotton has no real good regulation at this point, so definitely be aware if you are going to shop for organic cotton. Search for these specific certifications. There are more out there, but the GOTS is very well known, the Global Organic Textile Standard, as well as the Organic 100 Content Standard. Yeah, and the Regenerative Organic Certified is another one that has recently emerged, which also takes regenerative agriculture into effect, which is excellent. Next, there's also wool and merino wool. And I wanted to briefly touch on this because I think this is a great option. Many people believe that the carbon emissions from sheep is an issue, so you should avoid buying wool. But if we take a closer look, merino wool, it turns out it emits about 4.1 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per 100 grams of processed materials. For that same amount, per 100 grams, polyester emits around 4.6 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions. So it turns out polyester, in fact, it emits more carbon dioxide emissions than wool. And of course, cotton emits less at 2.8 kilograms. So I wanted to provide these statistics just to show that merino wool is a good option. It's actually emitting less carbon emissions than synthetic clothing fibers. Next. Other great alternatives, which I'll touch on, are linen. Very low water consumption, very low carbon emissions. It is excellent. It is very light, very comfortable. There is hemp, which also is very low water consumption, very low carbon emissions, and it is actually considered one of the strongest of all clothing materials in the world. Be aware when buying these, they aren't that hard to come by, especially if you do online shopping. But yeah, if you seek out local stores, you can, there should be some natural clothing, some stores with good natural and sustainable clothing options especially in bigger cities. And yeah, so just be aware, hemp and linen can be tricky because companies will say that this is a hemp t-shirt or a linen t-shirt when really it is only 20% hemp and the rest is just conventional cotton or synthetic clothing materials. And then there's also tencel, often traded by the name lyocell, and this is made from wood pulp, usually coming from well-managed forests, and it is low carbon emissions, and it is a great sustainable solution. And then there's viscose, often called rayon, which is also made from wood pulp, but apparently it's not the best option. A lot of chemical byproducts, and many sources have mentioned how much chemicals they do use to make this fabric and the chemicals that are on this fabric. So something to keep in mind there. Next. So in review, there were 4 main ways that I talked about for us to reduce plastic pollution and help to contribute to better disposal and cleanup of our plastics in our waterways. So that number 1 was reducing plastic while grocery shopping. Number 2 was reducing online shopping and trying to shop local. Number 3 was switching to natural fiber clothing as much as we can. And number 4 was ensuring our waste is disposed of properly. And number 5, I'll just take a moment to let you know about this next. So the Rideau Environmental Action League Shoreline Cleanup event is going to happen on Saturday, October 2nd, next month in Smiths Falls, Ontario. The exact locations and details and times will be announced. It's going to be in a lot of the areas that we were focusing on last fall, which when I went to visit them, unfortunately, they have just accumulated a whole bunch of garbage again. So if you want to get involved and give back to our waterways and help contribute to the reduction of this plastic pollution problem, do come and join us. And you can contact me for more details and to volunteer, and I will let you know more of the details closer to the date. So you can text me, call me, or email me at either of these, phone number or email here. And lastly, I'll just mention, so you can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, next. So here are a couple lists of references that I used. I tried to stick to reputable news and research organizations, and as well as universities and official organizations that I felt would be a good source for the information in this. If you want to do further research, again, you can contact me at that email. I'd be happy to send you this presentation that I put together and send you some of the references and some more details if you want to follow up on some of these things yourself. So that is everything for me tonight.
Sorry about that. So this is the time we have allotted for questions. So you can either, I can't get out of this, there we go. We can either put them in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourselves as well. I see Sydney has her hand up. So Sydney, if you want to unmute yourself or type in a question.
Yeah, hi Jake. Great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I do have a question about trash capture technology. Not sort of what you covered, but I'm just curious if you have any experience with using trash booms, and also if there's anything that exists that would be trash capture technology before microplastics, like whether that be something like physical, structural, or if I think I've heard of like microbe nets, so using like bacteria to capture microplastics. Yeah, just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, like I said, I'm very much beginning my research in this whole thing, like with this repair and restoration specialist. So I would love to be able to answer your question in more detail. I know there's a lot of awesome innovation happening there, but unfortunately, I don't know too much of those different things that are happening right now. But that is something that I'm actively looking into now and trying to learn more about. Yeah, so sorry I couldn't better answer your question.
No, that's okay. I know I threw a lot at you there. I work for like a conservation and restoration organization on a waterway, and we talk a lot about trash booms. So just wondering if you have any thoughts on it. But yeah, great presentation.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions? I am going to put Jake's email in the chat. So if you do come up with any questions afterwards, or if you would like more information about that cleanup that they are organizing in Smith Falls, you can email him there. We also, if you could, we have an anonymous evaluation of just the content that was covered tonight. And if you could just let us know your feedback on it, that would be really wonderful. There is a question in the chat from Greg, wondering if you're aware of any microplastic sampling in Ontario lakes. So I'll maybe let you go first, Jake, and then I have an answer for that as well.
Okay, I just remember coming across some sampling that was happening in Lake Ontario that seemed very interesting. We were doing some research on that, but that's the extent of my knowledge there. So it would probably be better if you answered that, Monica.
Sure, it's something that we at Watersheds Canada are also trying to find more information on, and Jake, just like Jake's saying, there isn't a lot of information about freshwater systems. So I think it was now 2 years ago, JP Thani did a study of a couple of different lakes in Eastern Ontario and put out a report of the different samples, plastic sizes that he found in his sampling. So it is something that we can include in that email when we send out a summary of the information and the recording of the webinar. Greg, I can make sure to put in that microplastic study, as it is, a bit, like Jake's saying, we all know there's plastic in there, but when you actually see the numbers, it gets a little more real and can really drive some local action and coming together as a community to make sure that we're doing our part to keep our waterways clean. And Peter's just saying good presentation, which I will echo. We're very thankful for your time tonight, Jake. And before we maybe let everyone enjoy what's left of their evening, I will just share our next webinar details. So this one is going to be a different issue that more and more lakes and rivers are seeing, which is the presence of invasive species. So we are going to be having Darissa from the Invasive Species Center up in Sault Ste. Marie speaking at the end of the month. So it'll be September 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And so I've just dropped in the chat the registration information for that webinar. And it's going to be a really great opportunity for you to learn about invasive species, about ones that are both on land, and there's going to be a specific focus on aquatic species, seeing what can be done, kind of like Jake was talking, how we can prevent invasive species from getting there in the first place, but if you are noticing them on your lake or river, what you can do in order to maybe remove them and work together as a community. There are lots of different pilot projects going on around the country to try and stop the spread of these invasive species. So you can register for that now. And again, that's happening Wednesday, September 29th. And I think, was there a session on microplastic? I think that when JP did the report earlier this, I think it was 2019 now because it was before COVID, it was just a report. There wasn't a webinar to go along with it, but we would absolutely be able to put that information in the findings. And I know that he is doing testing continually each year, so we can always follow up with him and see if he's produced a report to show, you know, what's happening year by year, if it's getting worse or what's going on there. So I think we're at the 8-minute mark. If people don't, oh, go ahead, Sam.
Oh, I was just going to say, just to add to the microplastic conversation, because there really is limited freshwater information at this point, but a great way to combat microplastics is through what the Jake is doing with the cleanups, is preventing microplastics from happening through the macroplastics of the larger plastics that degrade. So even if you can't directly remove the microplastics at this point, participating in a cleanup is a great way to help mitigate that risk near whatever water you're near.
Absolutely, we can all do our part. I'm sure all see plastic wherever we go. So I know that I'm the really cool person that while I'm walking my dog, if he happens to go to the bathroom beside some plastic, then I'll like pick it up with the dog bag anyway, because I'm already using plastic to do that. So why not pick up some things that are near me on the way too? So it's all these small things that we can try and stop plastic going into the water. All right, well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. Again, thank you so much to Jake for this wonderful presentation and giving us a lot of facts that we can spread with other people and just get a real scope of the problem, and then giving us some different action items. Like I said, we will be sending out kind of a handout with some information about what was shared tonight, some of those references that Jake included at the end of his presentation, and a recording of this webinar if you would like to pass it on to anyone else that you know.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It was wonderful. Thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate every opportunity I get to speak about this kind of thing.